Greetings and peace, loved ones. I pray everybody is in a state of beauty and expansion. This podcast is with Ali Hussain, who is a doctoral candidate in Islamic Studies in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at the University of Michigan. I've known this brother for a few years, and we corresponded. We have shared interests, particularly in Sufism, Islamic mysticism, and particularly in the thought of Ibn Arabi and Maulana Rumi. So he's doing his doctoral research on the thought of Muhyiddin Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi, who is one of the most famous and well-known Sufi thinkers in the West, even though he's far less well-known than Rumi. I think the reason for that is Rumi is very accessible in the sense, and he has profound beauty and wisdom that just emanate love, but it's poetically drawing from all aspects of shared human experience. Whereas Ibn Arabi, he's not Sufism 101. He is a very difficult writer in many ways, very complex. And his work is very beautiful. It was really after I got exposed to the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz and some of the Persian poets, it was the fact that I found a book on Rumi's thought that drew me to take up a serious study of Sufism and Islam. That was about 12 years ago now, and I guess I've been studying it ever since. But that was what really drew me to the path, not just to study it and not just to appreciate the poetry, but actually to commit myself to it. So his thought is particularly about Jesus in the thought of Ibn Arabi, which is a fascinating topic. So we talked about that, and we talked a lot about art and the role of artists and the relationship between creativity and spirituality. And I think I'll just let you guys dig it. So if you have any comments or questions or thoughts or suggestions about the podcast, feel free to send us an email to connect@barakablue.com. If you want to support, tell your people. If you want to support and you got some extra money to support with, then you can go to patreon.com/pathandpresent. Yes, here it is. One love. So, alhamdulillah, it's great to have you on here, Habibi. And
I love it.
And so I know you are a lover of Muhyiddin Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi, and we share that. In fact, Ibn Arabi was really the great pull for me after I got exposed to Rumi's poetry and fell in love with Sufi poetry, and then of course was in love with kind of the spirit and activism of like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali.
Mhm.
Those are kind of my first exposure to the general Islamic tradition.
Of course.
Somehow, which was a kind of strange story, but maybe for a later date, I came across the works of Ibn Arabi, and that was, for me, just the profundity of the depth and the cosmology and the kind of like philosophical approach, in a certain sense, to mysticism and to just understanding the human being and the just existence itself. That was for me like more profound than anything I had ever read in all my studies of the various world wisdom traditions. So perhaps you could introduce Ibn Arabi for those that aren't familiar, and then talk about your own calling to work with him?
Inshallah, absolutely. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu wa sallam barak ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. It's really difficult to describe Ibn Arabi, as you mentioned, and to try to introduce, who this person is. And it's amazing because I feel that, and I think in a sense you would agree, that Ibn Arabi is more well known in the West than he is in the East, for multiple reasons. But I think the best way to describe him is as someone like William James Morris described him, by saying that without much of an over exaggeration, just as Plato, his thought was kind of like the climax of Greek philosophy, and that everything after him kind of was an end note, or an afterthought to his own emanation. Ibn Arabi is kind of like that for not only Sufism, not only Islamic spirituality, but actually also for Islam in general and humanity in general. So he was born in the 12th century in 1165 in Spain, and he, at a very young age, he was born on the east coast of Spain in a city called Marcia, and then towards his childhood he migrated, and that was kind of like the beginning of an age-long travel where he was just traveling all the time. He moved to Sevilla on the west coast, and then already in his teens he had many spiritual rebirths. His first teacher, as he says, although he was Muslim, his spiritual teacher, the first one was Sayyidina Isa, Sayyidina Jesus, alayhi salam, may peace be upon him. And he would continue to inherit from multiple prophets some kind of spiritual inheritance, and he would meet with them in the spiritual realm. And then he began to travel extensively, basically from his late teens, early 20s, all over North Africa, all over the Iberian Peninsula, southern Spain, to Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya. And then towards the middle of his life, when he was about 30 years old, he went on a migration and migrated east. And he lived there, and obviously visiting numerous places as he did in the West. So he went to Cairo, Hebron, Anatolia, Iraq, and then he finally settled in Damascus, where he died, and he's buried he died in about 1238. So he lived about 63 years old, exactly the age of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that's just kind of like a snippet of his life. And I think if I'm trying to kind of explain what is the big deal about Ibn Arabi, I can answer that with also the answer to the question of what attracted me to him. I stumbled upon Ibn Arabi while I was applying for the PhD program. So my relationship with him is literally 4 or 5 years old. As I was reading various works on intelligence, and what is the meaning of intelligence, that was my initial interest in the PhD program. I left that eventually after I got introduced to Ibn Arabi. And now my research is on Sayyidina Isa, Jesus alayhi salam, in the writings of Shaykh al-Akbar Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi. But when I stumbled upon Ibn Arabi, I stumbled upon a story that happened to him when he was a child. And this was when he migrated with his family from his hometown of Marcia in eastern Spain to the city of Sevilla. And he must have been maybe like 9 or 10 years old at the time. And he says, as I'm traveling in the countryside of Iberia, of Spain, I look at the trees and I noticed that the leaves always fall during the autumn, and they die in the winter, and then new leaves are born in the spring. And there is this aspect of the tree that always goes through a change. It never stays the same. And yet the tree itself, the trunk of the tree and the root of the tree is constant. So he's like, there is these two aspects of the universe, an aspect that always goes through a change and an aspect that is always constant. And he's like, the thing that is constant, that which we know and feel deep in our hearts is always constant, is the divine essence. And that which always goes through the cycle of birth, growing to old age, and then dying and withering away is actually the kind of, he would say, the names and attributes, the like incessant, continuous, infinite manifestations, appearances, forms, and images. As soon as one comes, it goes away and dies. And he says those two things combined together, they're opposites. There is an aspect of creation that doesn't change and an aspect of creation that goes through constant change. He says those things together is what the Sufis call intoxication. Because when you're faced with that, the kind of constant with the change together, it puts you in a perplexity, because we can't understand it with our aql, with our minds.
Right.
The mind only understands things that are not opposite. They cannot meet one another.
Sure,
But the
there
fact
can't be a square circle, or something can't
Exactly.
be one and many. So
Exactly.
another way to look at it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's this idea of seeing unity in multiplicity, seeing the one in the many, which...
Exactly. Exactly. And so he says that for the Sufis is the essence of intoxication, because that is the door to which you can actually enter into the divine presence, because the divine presence transcends and is beyond our mind and the understanding of our mind. So you need a whole set of other faculties, other ways, in order to approach this, what he would eventually call hayra, or perplexity. Now, the question is it was very beautiful to read this, but the real issue for me that attracted me to Ibn Arabi when I read that, and to which until this day I believe he is the answer to not only a crisis in the Muslim community in the West, a crisis in the Muslim community worldwide, and a crisis in humanity at large, is because this story, his observation, his feeling, his connection with the tree was beyond what we would call religious term. So he's connecting, he's a humanist at this point. He's witnessing God in nature. So it's like when I read that, I can imagine the Native American kind of falling in love with Ibn Arabi. I can imagine the secular humanist falling in love with Ibn Arabi. And the amazing thing is he didn't even use a single term that we would call religious or Islamic. Sure. Nothing from fiqh, nothing from aqidah. It is just bringing, it is not dumbing down Islamic spirituality. It's actually revealing the human being as being truly sacred. So it's kind of lifting the human being to their true station. That in your essence, in your instinct, you're able to witness this amazing perplexity that is the creation. And when you do that, you're actually experiencing something that the saints talk about, which is intoxication. Right, so that was this I think sums up kind of my connection with this amazing saint, who for not, and it's obvious because nowadays Ibn Arabi is just known so far and wide in the West, and there is entire society devoted to him called the Muhyiddin Ibn Arabi Society, who basically they even do like retreats where they invite people. They're not Muslim, but they're studying his writings, they're doing his litanies, and they're reflecting and they're trying to receive openings through his experience. And so this basically, I think, sums up who Ibn Arabi is and why I became attracted to him.
Yeah, that's Very much interesting. And I think if you look at a parallel, I've thought about this a lot, that you have much of what you described about why Ibn Arabi is popular in the West is to a large extent why Rumi is so popular in the West. Because
Absolutely.
the imagery, I mean, if you read Rumi, like, he is using imagery from the well of common human experience, right?
Exactly.
He's talking about nature and going to the market and having a family and, just reflecting on the signs of nature, like things that we all experience. He says, you see the foam, but you don't see the sea, right? He says,
Exactly.
you see the dust kick up in the wind, but you don't see the wind. So he's talking about these very profound metaphysical realities in the most, you could say, mundane terms. But of course,
Mundane terms, yes.
what he's pointing out is that nothing is truly mundane. Nothing
Exactly.
is not sacred, and that's what I hear you saying with Ibn Arabi. And unfortunately, a lot of people tend to think of religion as, just in general, you think of a church or a mosque or a priest, or you think of praying, or you think of meditating, or these different traditions. But again, these are the forms, but always
Yes.
at the essence of each tradition is this idea that the forms are to get to the meaning, to awaken a certain state, to develop a certain consciousness, to reveal a certain awareness, which should be at all moments. It's not about the outward trappings of the tradition, which are valuable, but they're valuable for what they do to the human being, ideally.
And that in its essence has to do, I think, the problem that you mentioned, of fixating on the forms is, I mean, there was a whole aspect of, for example, divine law like Sharia.
Mm-hmm.
There was a whole aspect in Sufism of studying the batin of Sharia, studying the inward aspects of Sharia that is no longer present. So, for example, in the Meccan openings, the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, Ibn Arabi's largest work, there is an entire, I think, almost like 200-300 pages where he just talks about the inward aspects of the Sharia. And he does things like, why is it permissible to wear your shoes in prayer? And his answer is, he says, the reality of the matter is that prayer is a journey and you cannot travel barefoot. Right? He says, why do we have the right hand over the left hand? And he was actually Maliki. So he would adhere to the opinion, it would seem like he should adhere to the opinion of letting the hands at the sides during prayer. But he said, I believe that you put the right hand over the left hand. And he says the reason for that is because the hand of God is over their hand. So what is missing is not only not discussing metaphysics, not discussing the spiritual world or how the material world is spiritual in its root, but even divine law, its reality, which is the spiritual world. And I mean, the way that the Sharia, the way that divine law connects with the material world, that's just the form. There is the reality of the Sharia that has to do with the spirit. Sure. That's not discussed. But I think the key here is also what you mentioned about, that somebody like Ibn Arabi or like Rumi, they talk in mundane terms, but they're actually spiritualizing the world. A person, that we both share great admiration for, Professor Chittick, in his recent work, Divine Love, which is an amazing collation of essays and translations on the Sufis from the 10th and the 11th century and how they wrote about love. And if you read that work, it'll completely transform one's understanding of how Muslims in the past approached scripture, approached hadith, approached understanding the story of Sayyidina Adam in paradise. But one of the things that Professor Chittick says in the beginning, he says, I used to think that if there is one idea, one theme that defines Islam was knowledge. He says, but after studying the great works of the Sufis for 20 years and understanding better the time period they lived in, I am convinced now that Islam is best described by love.
Mm-hmm.
Love is what best describes the Islamic tradition. And in reality, that comes from the famous narration that the Sufis adhere to, which describes the purpose of creation. I was a hidden treasure, God says, and I loved to be known.
Mm-hmm.
So the first thing that came is love, and then knowledge was born out of love.
Yeah.
And the infatuation with knowledge reveals a lot more about the times we're living in. But then the second thing that Professor Chiddick says that I wanted to say is that he says, if you consider the normal person that lived 800 years ago, this normal person was a farmer who lived away from the major cities like Baghdad or Damascus or Central Asia. And these people, the farmers, were illiterate, and they barely had enough money to sustain themselves. If they had any money, they would not use that money to travel to a major city like Baghdad and attend the scholarly circles, because they would even have to learn how to read and write first before they go and listen to these scholars like Ghazali and others.
Mm-hmm.
He said, so how did these people connect with God? How did these people practice their religion? He's like, it was through memorizing poetry. They would memorize the poetry of Rumi, the poetry of Ibn Arabi, the poetry of Attar, the poetry of Hafiz. In Turkey, the poetry of Yunus Emre, and the poetry of these great poets. And then by reciting this poetry while they're farming, while they're harvesting, while they're planting the seeds, while they're taking care of the animals, their mundane life instantly becomes worship.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes a connection with God. They're dealing with God by tending to the animals. Because this poetry, this idea of reciting poetry mixed with the correct understanding of reality, of how the universe works, you begin to perceive that you're not actually doing something that's taking you away from God, and then you have to go to the masjid, the mosque, or the church in order to recharge your battery. That mindset is very new. People in the past, they knew that there is no such thing that if I'm working or I'm tending to the animals or I'm planting flowers, that I'm doing something that has to do with this world. Nothing is away from the divine manifestation. And if you have that perception, everything is filled with love and everything is filled with beauty. So that really is the importance of Ibn Arabi, is because he and Maulana Rumi, it's because they allowed to ignite that memory of how to perceive the universe and its intimacy with God.
Absolutely. And I think that's a key thing. I mean, we don't really often think about the fact that, what are we as human beings beyond our forms is we're kind of points of perception or levels of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't necessarily understand the way that what the kind of paradigm that we have taken on colors everything we see. There's that saying which is so true, that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are.
Yes.
And that's one of the things which I think is not really necessarily acknowledged enough in our time, is that yes, there's a lot of Muslims, there's a lot of Christians, but how many of them have taken on a kind of worldview which is actually alien to the tradition, in a sense where you might go to mosque or go to church, but you're essentially looking at a dead universe, right? You've taken on the kind of secular worldview in which, it's just this kind of the mechanistic reductionist paradigm, whereas, like you said, that farmer or that, great poet or metaphysician, all the way through the social structure, they were looking at nature as ayat. They were looking at the entire cosmos as a you could say like a matrix of the divine names, and they were looking at this all as a kind of a dance of love, a communication with the human being to awaken something deep within us that we've always known, but perhaps we've lost touch with. You know what I mean? And it's like we think in the West that, oh, now we're so advanced, we don't have a creation story. The
No.
old people did, but no, we have our creation stories too, and those color profoundly, right? If you believe that the entire existence came from, like you say, an absolute infinite source of mercy, which loved to be known,
Hmm.
and this love and knowledge, this interplay of that. So then this is what this whole thing is. That's going to deeply color every aspect of your life, that this whole thing is about love and knowledge and coming to experience and these type of things. Whereas if you
Yes.
believe, if your creation story is that the whole universe came from the head of a pin in size to the almost, seemingly infinite vastness in the split instant, but that there was no intention, no purpose. It's just a complete accident. And
Yes.
then in deep time, accidentally and randomly, certain beings came from single-celled organisms to the vast multiplicity of flora and fauna that we see on the earth. And then certain of these beings developed consciousness and could reflect on the fact that the universe came from almost nothing in a single instant. But it doesn't mean anything. It's just an accident. Whether we exist or not, it doesn't matter. Like, if that is your paradigm, it's going to completely color how you exist, how you relate to others, how you relate to yourself. And
Or decolor.
yes, for sure.
Or decolor, yes.
And so I think these things are really important. Like the paradigm that we take colors or decolors everything. But one thing that is interesting about Ibn Arabi, when I read him, is that, and I think this is something that interests you about him, is that
Yes.
he's really interested in the imaginal realm. And he talks
Yes.
about that the aql, the intellect, the rational mind, it has its place and it's important. But fundamentally of utmost importance in the human being is the faculty which he talks about as the imaginal faculty. And that, I'd like to hear you talk about that and maybe explain that a bit, because we tend to think about the imagination. I mean, we think about creativity and art as powerful and important, and the great poets and the great, right,
Yes.
Shakespeare and Tolstoy and these type of people, and the great musicians and things, and painters and
Hmm.
sculptors as important. But we also, I feel like, tend to also degrade the imagination, because we say,
Yes.
oh, that's just your imagination, and you know what I mean?
Yes.
It's like,
Yes.
it's not
Yes.
real, it's not cold hard facts and stuff like that. So talk about what Ibn Arabi's understanding of the imagination and the imaginal realm and its importance.
Absolutely. So that's really to the heart of the matter, right? That this the belief in an imaginal realm, like an actual place in the reality of our existence, that is called the imaginal realm, where imagination comes from, separates how the ancients understood reality from our understanding. Our understanding is thoroughly dualistic. And by that, I mean either specifically religious, like the religious discourse, the religious conversation today, the theology that is taught is that God is very distant from the world. We kind of pay lip service to the fact that everything is under divine control and divine will, but God doesn't really get involved in the world. And even if we don't say that outright, our actions, like we were talking, like, the farming, the working, the dealing with people, is considered to be taking us away from God. It's part of dunya, and then part of this lowly life. And then, in order to really connect with God, you have to go to the mosque, you have to go to the church, you have to recharge your battery. And the people in the past, one of the great works about Ibn Arabi is called Alone with the Alone. Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi by a French philosopher named Henri Corbin. And Henri Corbin, this is his major point. He says, in the past, people believed that there was a realm in existence where spirits and bodies can meet, where the spiritual world can interact with the material world. We don't have that anymore. People don't believe in that anymore. What we have now is we have the physical world, and I'm talking about now people who are claim to be religious or espouse a religion, a faith and a belief. They believe that there is this material world and then there is the spiritual world. But how the spiritual world interacts with the material world, we don't have an answer for that anymore. And so Ibn Arabi says that anybody who believes in dualism, meaning in saying that the universe is established on the spiritual world and the material world only, they don't understand how reality works. He says reality is always based on triplicity, meaning you have two opposites and then a barzakh in between them. And that comes from the Quran. So the Quran says, God says, He merged the two seas, they do not meet, they do not transgress one another. He merged the two seas, they meet, and between them is a barzakh or isthmus in Arabic, in English, an isthmus, a divider, a liminal space, an interstice, where a threshold where they don't transgress, so that they don't transgress one another. So these two oceans, these two bodies of water, they're not just the fresh and the salty water of the earthly seas and oceans. It's also the salty water is actually the body, the human body. And the fresh water is the pure spirit. And there is a barzakh in between them. There is this threshold, and that threshold is what's known as alam al-khayal, the imaginal realm that Ibn Arabi talks about. Before I talk about the details of this, it's really important to note that for Ibn Arabi, as all the ancients believed, what exists in the larger universe exists inside the human being. So in the universe, we have the spiritual realm, the material realm, and then the imaginal realm in between them. And the human being has the body, which represents the material realm, has the spirit, which represents the spiritual realm, and then the soul, the nafs, or we can call this, say, the ego, represents the barzakh in between them. Now, the ramifications of this is huge. First of all, if we look at the large universe, Ibn Arabi describes this alam al-khayal, the imaginal realm. He says it's a world where bodies become spiritualized and spirits become corporalized or embodied. They like, it's like a body that becomes subtle, that dresses itself in a spirit, so that it can break the bounds of time and space, essentially. And spirits get dressed in a body that puts a certain type of limitation on it, like a cast, like a body cast, but for the spirit, in order so that it can interact. Why do we need this? Because spirits, in their nature, are absolutely subtle. They have no form. There's no dimension to spirits. It's just complete light. No form, no dimensionality. And bodies are very dense. They are restricted by time and space. So there has to be a middle ground where the body meets the spirit. And that's what takes place in this imaginal realm. For the human being, what this means is that the body, Ibn Arabi says, can get dragged to the world of spirits. It can ascend. And when the body, through the power of the soul, through undertaking the journey towards God, towards the divine presence, the soul is climbing towards the spirit. But while it is doing that, it is grabbing the body along with it. And when that happens, the body no longer becomes like other bodies of this world. It actually becomes like a spirit, which means it gets released from the boundaries of time and space. It can break the boundaries of time. It can travel in light speed, as the stories of saints have abundance proof of that. And if the soul is dragged down to the world of the bodies, then it loses complete touch with its spiritual origin, and it becomes no different than the animal self, say, or like a mineral, a rock. There is no intellection, there is no reflection, there is no contemplation. And this is kind of what distinguishes the human being, in the sense of having this comprehensiveness to reach all the way from the lowest of the low to the highest of the high. But in order for all of that to make sense, you have to have this imaginal realm in the back of your heart, not really in the back of your mind. It's in the back of the heart. Like to be aware of the existence of a realm where the bodies and the spirits do interact, that the spirits is not just superstition, is not just a figment of a fantasy. It is part of everyday being. It is what, and it's actually a higher level of reality than our material bodies, right? Because the material body is rooted in the spirit, not the other way around. And so because of that, because the imaginal realm is a little bit higher than the material realm, it is in between the material and the spiritual, the imagination, which include our dreams, include our creative inspiration, which I think this is where we're getting to. This is the most important thing. Creative inspiration. This is actually a higher level of reality than everything we do with our bodies. Precisely because it's closer to the spirit, and precisely because it's closer to our root. Right? So this is like a gist of the imaginal realm.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. At the end, that brings up for me this idea that, without like reducing the vast kind of like diversity of the various traditions
Mm-hmm.
in human history, it's clear that basically all the world wisdom traditions teach that consciousness is primary, or spirit,
Mm-hmm.
or awareness, and that is the ultimate, ultimate infinite awareness, consciousness, presence is the divine reality, and then
Yes.
everything else kind of like descends from that, you could say. And so
Yes.
the world of form and bodies is kind of like the last. It's the most outward of that reality, and so
Yes.
of course the modern materialist paradigm is based on that the material world is actually primary, and it's really all there is. And so
Mhm.
consciousness, awareness, imagination, these must um, emerge from some physical thing, as opposed to the physical must emerge from the spirit.
From the spiritual, yes.
But I think these ideas, because they can be foreign to a lot of us, I think the analogy of dreaming is really important. And I know Ibn Arabi talks a lot about dreaming,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because I even read in one of the passages that he said the only reason that sleep is in the world for human beings is so that people who haven't kind of like had this veil removed to the imaginal realm, as far as like haven't had openings in which they kind of are firmly aware of it in a waking state, that
Yes.
they will have experience of it in that sleeping state. And then he talks about this idea that when we dream, we eat and drink and have experiences, and there's, oh, my uncle was there, and my next door neighbor that I grew up with, and all these type of people. But in reality, we know, because we've all dreamt and then we've all awakened, that
Mm-hmm.
all of those things that you saw, all the individuals and the items and the ideas and the conversations, they were all you. They were
Yes.
all you. Like it wasn't
Yes.
that there was someone else. No, it was you. We woke up and realized that was part of your, whether you want to call it imagination, consciousness, whatever. that was you. And so your thoughts, your consciousness, your awareness takes various forms. And so Ibn
Yes.
Arabi, says something which is really beautiful and really amazing. Really, he seems to say that all of existence is essentially the dream or the imagination of the divine.
Yes. Yes. Exactly. Exactly. Absolutely. That's and this is we can begin to tie in creative inspiration by saying this is straight aligned straight from Shakespeare, who said we are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. That the idea that yes, when you see a dream, what we now consider to be dreams, meaning that we are asleep and we see something, and we see all those people, we interact with all those people, and then when we do see them, we wake up and we realize that it was a figment, it was us, it was our consciousness. And when Ibn Arabi says that now in a waking state, you think that you're no longer sleeping, but in reality, it's the divine imagination projecting itself upon a series of mirrors. But really, what he's really saying is that everyone you interact with while in an awakened state, they are also figments of your imagination. And what do I mean by that? What he means by that is that, and you mentioned this before, we don't know things, we don't know the world, we don't know people as they are, we know them as we are. So Ibn Arabi relies upon a hadith Qudsi, a holy narration where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I am as my servant thinks of me. And that's not just Ibn Arabi says it's not just sentimentals, right? It's actually, it is like there is an agency, there is power to the imagination. If you think, if you believe, if you imagine mercy, that is what you will receive.
Sure.
And so the universe is like a mirror to us. It reflects back to us who we are. And the issue becomes, if the divine is reflecting upon himself in the universe, how can evil exist? How can evil exist if it's just a reflection of the divine? And that is when we begin talking about broken mirrors and unclean mirrors. Because in reality, the fault in the reflection never goes back to the one who's reflecting.
Sure.
But the fault goes upon the mirror that's supposed to do the reflection.
Sure.
And the secret here is also the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, who talked about people seeing him in the dream. He says, whoever sees me, they have really truly seen me. For shaitan, iblis, Satan cannot appear in my form. Well, what does that mean now? That it has to do with the verse of the Quran, know that within you is the messenger of God. Not the normal literal translation of know that the messenger of God is amongst you. It says fikum, which means know that the messenger of God is within you. He is inside of you. Because it's this ongoing project of the divine reflecting upon himself. And I've always, liked to be just a little bit controversial with a poetic license, and say that Ibn Arabi, since he said that the universe is kind of divine imagination, it's really a divine dream. And with a poetic license, we can say, if God wakes up, it's all over. And but it's what that means is that this ongoing process of creation is really like a divine painting or a divine play. All the beautiful colors of the universe, Any beautiful imagery that we see is the divine painting. And any beautiful sound that we hear, any beautiful image that we create or that exists in nature, any beautiful sound that we hear or that we make of music is a divine symphony, the divine composing. And any beautiful writing that we come across of prose or poetry is divine writing, divine speech. And essentially, I mean, this is really where I am at right now, considering this God as the absolute artist,
Mm.
as the artist, the source of artistry, the source of art, and those of his creation that represent him best are those who are artists. If they are prophets, they are saints, they are artists whose inspiration has reached the level of revelation. If they are saints, they are artists of souls. And if they are, we call them artists, just artists, including Shakespeare, Gibran Khalil Gibran. Now we're talking about non-religious people who we don't consider to be religious artists.
Mm-hmm.
These are types of saints, and the reason is it has to do with this imaginal realm, and this is something that Henri Corbin talks about in Alone with the Alone, and it's also specifically emphasized by Harold Bloom, who talks about it in the preface. That what Ibn Arabi is doing with the imaginal realm, he's not just delineating or marking out a religious idea. He's actually saying that creative inspiration for art, no matter, even if the artist is an atheist, creative inspiration comes from the same place as divine revelation. The only thing that distinguishes it from divine revelation is the level of clarity.
Mm. Mm.
And this is absolutely crucial, because this means that art, the artistic process, the energy that comes to an artist's soul and being and heart through inspiration, is in its original form divine revelation. Now, what the artist does that through their mirror, how they channel that energy, what they do with it, that's a whole different issue.
Sure.
That's how we get good art and low art.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, mashallah, there's so much that that brings up for me. And I mean, when you started off talking about dreams, I mean, I've always thought about there's like a few sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, about dreams, right? You know, people are sleeping and when they die, they wake up.
Exactly.
Right? And then he also said, peace be upon him, die before you die. In
Die
other
before you
words,
die.
wake up before you wake up. Like, wake up before it's all over. And, you know, then there's the beautiful hadith of Jibril, where he defines ihsan as to worship God as if you see him, and if you don't see him, to know that he sees you. So if we again take the poetic license to re-articulate that vis-a-vis the dreaming and awakening and death, that we could say, live this dream as if you are awake. And if you are not awake, know the awake is watching you dream.
Allahu Akbar, that's it. That's exactly, that's straight to the point.
And you know, if you think about art, you know, definitely as someone, you know, obviously I'm a musician and poet, so like the greatest moments of my life, literally, have been, as far as my feeling of expansiveness, of profundity, of stepping outside of time, of tapping into like dissolving or expanding / dissolving the boundaries of self. You know, those experiences which now in kind of modern secular terms people are calling like flow or being in the zone or whatever you want to call it. I mean, anything you call it, it trivializes it. But I think we've all experienced it. I mean, I experienced it first when I think as a child we experienced it all the time. We're kind of always in that state. But then, when I was a teenager playing basketball, I would sometimes, like, you would get in this state where you knew where your teammate was going to be before he was there, your opponent, where he was going to throw the ball before it was there, and people talk about being in the zone where you literally can't miss. It's like the hoop is like expands. And then the second way I experienced it as I got a little bit older was in music and like freestyling and like this idea of we are just going to improvise in the moment, creativity. I'm going to speak to a beat and I'm going to make it rhyme and make sense. And now, we talk about like in that improv moment, or you think about jazz music, right, where there's this improv, which freestyling comes out of. And each musician in the group knows the capability of the other musicians in the group because you've played with them many times, that they're your bandmates, right? But every once in a while, one of them would break through and he would be riding a wave which is beyond his normal capacity as far as the notes he's hitting, the rhythm, the perfection of his playing, the inspiration, that he was playing from beyond his kind of like lowercase I, and everyone would feel it and it would affect everyone. And then he would go on a solo and it would bring everyone up, and everyone was conscious and aware that he would ride it for a while and then he would maybe fall off. Like, he's riding a wave. Think of a surfer. And then all of a sudden he loses it. But then the next person off of that inspiration would then jump in and try to ride that wave because he noticed that, you know what I mean? So we can experience those things. And I think what you're saying is the arts are, when I'm saying like the most profound experiences of my life, some of them, they've either been in two things. They've either been in what we would consider more like spiritual, like whether it's prayer or fasting or dhikr, right? Or, contemplation, or when I'm writing.
Exactly.
And, for me, I don't separate those two things. Like those are all, you know what I mean? Like, and I think I once asked, there's a friend of mine who is an imam, but he used to be a jazz musician. And I asked him, I said, why do you think that so many people from a musical background end up taking the spiritual path of La ilaha illallah, considering that there's a vast majority, there's a lot of people on the path that claim that music is a low thing or is an unacceptable thing, etc.
Yes.
And he said, well, think about it. These are people that devote their life to the unseen.
Subhanallah.
And, there's a type of dhawq that artists have. There's a type of experiential knowledge. Like you experience, right? Especially with music, like I'll just speak on that because that's the one I have the most experience with, is like you're dealing with an intangible entity. You're dealing with an unseen thing that can evoke and create profound sadness, profound joy. It can bring one back to a childhood experience. It can heal one's heart. It can burst one's heart open, right? And think about the industry of music, multi-billion-dollar industry, right? It pervades our life. We have it in our headphones. It's in the supermarket, right? There's award ceremonies. You can't have a gathering in the evening anywhere on earth where there's not music coming through the speakers on some level. And yet all of this industry, all of the CDs and plastic cases and the MP3s and all the physical things and the performances and the festivals and everything, it is all for something that is unseen. It is all for something that no one has ever touched, no one has ever seen, no one has ever felt with the physical, tangible body. But yet it's this entire massive thing that's at the center of human civilization. And so, I mean, I could go on, but I'd love to hear more of what you have to say about this.
You've hit on so many points. Two of them that I just wanna remark. You mentioned that idea of transcending time, right? Like what they call being in the zone, the aha moment, transcendence, of nothing can go wrong. It's amazing. Essentially, that is the description of what a wali, of what a saint is.
At all
because
times.
according
Right.
at all times. So the famous description of a saint, according to the holy narration, is God says, "I become the eye with which he sees. I become the hand with which he strikes," is what the hadith says, but really we can say the hand with which he writes.
Mm-hmm.
I become the foot with which he walks. What that means is that the artist is given a glimpse into the order and the harmony of things. If we were to look at it from like a Buddhist, like Confucianist perspective, they're looking at the harmony of things, the order of things. They cannot go wrong because when they say they're in the zone, they're like riding, they're like a completely submissive body in the ocean of reality. The ocean is carrying them, and they're just witnessing and they're narrating, they're witnessing and they're writing, they're listening and they're singing. And that's exactly what wilaya is. And it's not surprising that T.S. Eliot, in his Dry Salvages poem, he describes, he says, the intersection, the point of the intersection of the timeless with time, that is an occupation for the saint, because the saint is like an open portal. They are the imaginal realm. They are imagination. You're looking at a body of a saint, but in reality their bodies are just like gates or doors that go into the spiritual world. Their bodies are like those bodies that have been pulled all the way to the level of the spirit, and so they are divine artwork. And when you look at them, you're looking at an artist who is not only producing art, but they are so in tune with their artistry that they have become art. You look at them and, you're looking at a person who is himself like his own artwork. He's his own or her own masterpiece. That's really key in terms of connecting artistry to wilaya. The second thing relating to music, and I dare say, this is like where I am finding my kind of niche in terms of art, and learning music. But the amazing thing about music is, Hazrat Inayat Khan, he regards music as the highest form of art, precisely because of what you said. It is completely formless. It has no form. It is the primordial sound. So creation began with God speaking. And when God spoke, humanity didn't see any form. They just heard the voice. They heard the sound. And when they heard, they perished because the sound was so beautiful. The voice of God, the essence of all beauty. You can think about all the major modes of Western music, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the major, the minor, and all keys combined together into a beautiful harmony. All the Eastern maqam, the maqamat that I'm studying right now, of Bayati and Sabba and Hijaz and Rast and Nihawand and Ajam, and all of these, thousands of them, combined together into a beautiful harmony and lumped together into just one sound, one breath that was so powerful, so perfect in its beauty, so perfect in its majesty, that after God created creation and he spoke to them, asking them, "Am I not your Lord?" not only did they faint, they actually perished from existence altogether. That he created them once again just so that they reply. And this is why one of our teachers, Habib Umar, he said, when human beings hear a beautiful sound, the reason it affects them is because it ignites a memory. They remember when God spoke to them. And so music was actually the first, or when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when God loved to be known, and he undertook this divine art project of creating creation, the first art form he utilized was music, by speaking, and then came the visual creation. And Ibn Arabi will even tell us, in the levels of existence before the appearance of the physical universe, and before God even spoke to creation, there was the inner dialogue of God with himself, the divine essence speaking with the names and attributes. And that was inner music. That was like inner reflection. And then came the outer sound. Then came the visual. And then the end of this creation in paradise, where human beings in paradise will be able to gaze upon God and receive the beatific vision that Dante talks about of Beatrice, but really it's the beatific vision of God. That in its essence is visual art. So creation began with auditory music and will end with a visual art. So this creation began with music, began with art, and ends with painting, ends with visual art, and so it ends with art as well. And so we're just in the middle of art. And this is exactly why art is so important. For me today, the time period that we're living in, after we have discussed the catastrophe, the existential catastrophe that human beings are facing now, especially religious people, and especially Muslims in our case, because that's the religion we belong to, is the artists I perceive them as being really the last hope. Because we are seeing now as like something is precipitating even in religious discourse, is so far away from art, that is so far away from aesthetics. So you talked about how imagination is degraded as being just fantasy, not really as serious as dear God. I mean, if we just look at vocations, most people in our religious community, the Muslims in America, they all become doctors and engineers. Mm-hmm. We rarely see people become artists and humanists. It's because it's considered to be not really a serious thing. But in reality, that's because the religious foundation that is supposed to give us and grant us the correct understanding of how the universe works, that it began with love, it began with art, it began with music, it will end with love, it will end with art, and it will end with a type of visual art. That religious discourse, that religious foundation, is very much a product of secularism. Sure. It is a product of the Enlightenment. It is a product of God is in your private life, God is in the mosque, God is in the church, God is not in the world. You will not perceive God at the museum, at the art museum, when in reality,
we relate to God like a drill sergeant. You know what I mean? God yes. is the relation to God is rule based in the same, just like, if you study engineering, you just have to you memorize a series of how things work. You know what I mean? Like, this is how things work. You memorize that. It's like, and so you memorize what God wants and you do that. Like, that's the primary mode of relationship, that a lot of people have to quote unquote religion.
And that's like someone who keeps studying the chemical composition of honey but never tastes it once in his life. And on top of that, he gets upset and he degrades people who actually taste honey.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. And for that reason, art, I see it as really kind of the last. They're like, so in a time period when there's a lot of human suffering, there's a lot of wars, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of injustice, not just the apparent things that we see, but injustice in normal human dealings. This idea of being a drill sergeant, of always looking at the other in terms of a set. So a human being now to us is someone who either applies the rules really well or doesn't apply them really well, but not really a set, like an emotions, a perplexing manifestation of divine attributes, all of that. And when the saints of God are hidden and they hide themselves for wisdom. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to provide balance so that there is an outlet of mercy for people, for humanity, I believe those are the artists. I believe those are the painters, because they're like vortexes. They're like a portal into the spiritual world.
Yeah.
And and they take the suffering of the world and they translate it into something that is beautiful. And you have to do that. So for example, in the United States, you mentioned music. Like for me, jazz music will always be the most powerful form of activism.
Mm.
If you think about the ney in the motif of the ney. So Maulana Rumi, his most famous poem probably is, he talks about in the Mathnavi, he talks about the ney. He says, "Look at the ney, how it longs to return to the reed bed."
Mhm.
I mean, think about that. There is this stick of wood. It's ripped out from its homeland.
Mhm.
That's basically what the major trends of human suffering have been over the past 100 years,
Mm.
200 years. Human beings that have been a race or a group of people, an ethnicity that has been ripped out of its homeland.
Mhm.
And that is suffering. So
Mhm.
the ney suffers. But then look at what happens to the ney. It gets drilled and emptied from the inside. And it gets holes are made in it. And in Sufi understanding, the idea of emptying the wood from the inside is like emptying the nafs. It's like burning the ego away. And that's after the suffering takes place. That's
Mhm.
after getting ripped out from the reed bed. You get emptied from the inside, and then you get 7 holes drilled into you. And there's supposed to be points of kashf. There's supposed to be points of unveiling into the outside world. And then after that, you get burnt and you get straightened out, and then the divine breath comes in, and there is music. But the most amazing thing about the music that comes from the ney is that everyone who listens to it is actually participating in the lamentation.
Mm.
They're actually participating in the longing that the ney has for going back to the reed bed. And they actually become advocates for that. And so jazz music is actually a type of the story of the ney for the African American people in the United States,
Mhm.
because it is expressing, and it will because it pierces through. This is the thing about music and art. It pierces through social constructs. It pierces through political ideologies. It doesn't care about political ideologies. It'll crash them down. It'll destroy them and go straight for the heart. It'll go for the jugular,
Sure.
because it is speaking to the human spirit. And so if that happens, precisely because it's formless, precisely because it doesn't rely upon language, it relies upon the language of the heart, which is from the world of spirits. And that's why, one of the poetries of Rumi is translated as, music is the language of God.
Mhm.
This is the language that God speaks in. And Hazrat Anayat Khan, he says, look, all the early revelations, they were music.
Mm.
The Hindu revelation, the early revelations, they were music. The Psalms of David, they were music. It was a type of singing and chanting.
Mhm.
There was no, and if you take a primordial sound that you're chanting and you just break it up into small breaths, and you change the way where the makhraj, like the
Mhm.
pronunciation place in your body, you get words.
Mhm.
So music is already at the root of language, but it's the secret sound. It's that original sound, what the Sufis call the Sawt Sarmad, the basically the sound of silence.
Mm.
You know how, like, we have in music this idea of a drone, like something that's in
Yep.
the background?
Mhm.
It's the ongoing drone,
Mhm.
but it's like the spirit of all the music. And so like for especially for if I were to say about Muslims in America, or our existence as like of the Muslim faith, if this issue whether music is allowed or forbidden, I am I am inclined to say that without a serious devotion to art and music, there is no hope for Muslims in America.
Hmm. Yeah, I
We
mean,
have to
I
really
agree.
invest in it.
And I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that, um, I mean, on one hand, you think about all the great awliya and even the ulama, in our tradition, all the great, sages and the great scholars. It's hard to find one that didn't have a diwan. It's hard to find one
Mm,
who didn't have a
mhm,
compilation of poetry. And I
mhm.
thought about that, and I think there's something that happens when you start to awaken or you start to
SubhanAllah.
delve deeper or come more in contact with that imaginal realm is that that's that's the mode that you start to see things through, and the only way that it will essentially satisfy you is essentially you're seeing things as you're seeing the symbolic value in things. You're connecting dots, right? You're seeing a world in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour. You know what I mean?
SubhanAllah.
To hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and heaven in a
SubhanAllah.
wildflower. You're seeing I think that's really the important thing is like you're seeing not just things as like an engineer sees things as this is this, this is this is and this, but you're seeing that everything in the outward world it has meaning, and you're starting to connect, and
SubhanAllah.
you're seeing that if you see, uh, you know, in the marketplace, a mother, like a child who, loses its mother in the marketplace and is frightened and is afraid and is sad, right? And then it looks around and then you see the mother's face and she's like concerned, and then you see them like reunited. Like you see in that moment, not just, oh, that's something that just happened, but you say, man, this is the story of existence with
This is
separation
the
and
truth.
union and feeling alone and then becoming one again, multiplicity, right? Is to start peeling back the veil between this illusion that everything is just surface and everything is separate. And you're seeing that
Yes.
everything is interconnected and everything is meaning propped up in form. That's one thing. And then the second thing that I would say, and I've thought about this quite a bit, is that if you live in a traditional society,
Hmm.
um, and I think you're getting at this, is that the highest art is really the art of the self, the art of the soul, is attaining a Muhammadan heart, a transformed being. That is the
The
art.
transforming. Yes.
Your and it's interesting that the Sufis will talk about the heart being a mirror, or even like and then there's the idea of like the mirror that you polish, right, so that it can perfectly reflect the light, or even reflect the painting, reflect the artist, the artistry. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But
Yes.
if you think about in traditional terms, right, there was this reverence for the awliya, the saints, the sages. In each tradition, there's this idea of the spiritual master, the awakened
The spiritual
ones,
master.
right?
Yes.
And so you would know where that individual was. Like you said, if you were a farmer or a shopkeeper or whatever, that's fine. Maybe you weren't completely dedicated to the spiritual path and practice,
Hmm.
but you knew where to go if you wanted to seek those people out, whether they were in the village or whether they were on the mountaintop or in the cave or or in the desert or whatever it was, or the kind of wandering, dervish or what have you. Like you knew, and you had been in the presence of people who, in their presence, you felt like that door open to a realm beyond this physical world. And those were the people
Absolutely.
that were revered. Those were the celebrities of society, right? Those were literally
Yes.
the pre-modern celebrities. And so now in the modern world, most people haven't come in contact with those type of people. And
Hmm.
so most people, because in our modern world, seeing is believing,
Hmm.
is they either don't believe that those people exist, or they say, well, maybe once upon a time, but they're
Hmm.
not any anymore, right?
Yes.
And so, but the people that modern people go to, who fulfill that function in a certain sense, meaning
Yes.
those people who bring forth who beauty from the unseen. Those people who
Yes.
have a certain power to transmit something transcendent and something beyond the forms. Those people who have an unknown and inexplicable creative genius and power are the artists.
Absolutely.
And so the artists become the awliya for the majority of people. And that
Absolutely.
explains the devotion to them, the want to be like them, their poster on the wall, wear their t-shirts, wear their shoes, whatever fashion they have. And this reverence, this screaming, right? The image of the young girls passing out at a Beatles concert. You know what I mean? Because it's like
Yes.
they're
Absolutely.
and you see that in traditional societies, literally passing out in the presence of the awliya, because you can't take the profound intensity embodied in this being, right? The creative power of this individual. And so exactly what you say is like to forego and to forfeit over this realm to people who, like you say, maybe their mirror is somewhat corroded, or maybe they're not perfectly reflecting the light. And of course, none of us can. And that's one of the other aspects, is that for true artists, you always see the fault in your art. You always see the limitation of yourself.
Yes.
And everyone else
Yes.
says that's so amazing for a great artist. But a great artist, they say, that's not for me. All I see is my own faults, right? Right.
Subhanallah. Very true.
And it's
And
like, and just in closing, like, before you go on, is like, I had this conversation with my dear friend brother Ali, who is an amazingly
mhm,
inspired artist,
mhm,
and he said a few months back, and this is before Kanye West kind of had essentially like a mental breakdown on tour,
mhm,
and he said, I went to the Kanye West show when he came to Minneapolis, and he goes,
mhm,
it was so intense because it was so, on the one hand, between creative genius, but on the other hand, extreme narcissism. It was like
mhm,
it was like straddling the line so intensely that at one moment I'd be like, "This is so beautiful," and in another moment I would feel like, "This is disgusting." And he said, and
wow.
what it was like, he described it as like the entire like floor where the stage would be was just speakers, and so the stage was actually hanging from the ceiling. It was suspended above. And
Wow.
for 2 hours, the speakers just reverberated and it would like build up. And Kanye hadn't come out yet. And you would think he's coming out. And so everyone would start, it was building this momentum and this awe and this waiting. And is it coming? And this moment, the final moment when he actually arrives. And for 2 hours, it would oscillate like that. And then finally, he came out. And he was suspended from the stage, hanging above the crowd, just out of
Mm,
their reach, so they could reach, but they couldn't quite grab it. And he was literally hanging on a stage. When the stage moved, it floated all over the stadium. And the stage would turn, would come sideways, like, so he was hanging off, but he was attached to it by chains so he wouldn't fall off. So he was like hanging at an angle. And everyone's reaching for him and he's just beyond their reach, you know what I mean? And he didn't even
mm,
acknowledge their presence. He would just perform. There was no like, "Hey, how's everybody doing? It's great to be here." It was nothing. It was just, there's no one here but him.
mm.
And he said on some level it was like really like creative and really, but it was so also like nafsi. And in that moment when he said that, I felt, you know, a line of Rumi came to me, where
Mm,
Rumi says this amazing thing where he says, you know, he's comparing Pharaoh and Hallaj.
mhm.
He says, the Pharaoh, he says, "I am your Lord." And Hallaj says, "Ana al-Haq." I am the ultimate reality. I am the
Yes.
real. And he goes, outwardly, they're saying the same thing in a certain
You're saying
sense.
the same thing.
He said, but
Subhanallah.
inwardly, they couldn't be more different. Because
Yes.
Pharaoh is saying it from his individual I, his nafs, his ego. But Al-Hallaj is saying it from his absence of self, that it is the divine voice speaking through him, because he is literally fana, passed beyond the boundary of his selfhood.
Yes.
And so, art is like that too. Is it like the true beauty and profundity? It comes from beyond yourself. And the true artist sees that and knows that. I mean, think about Rumi. He'll have like the most beautiful poem ever, literally like crushingly beautiful and profound
Mhm.
and deep, and just the imagery that he's drawing on it. And then he'll end it. How many of his poems he ends? He says, "But now I must remain silent because I'm ashamed of my words." Right? Or he
Mm.
says, "I've described love in all these ways, but when I got to love, I'm always ashamed of my exposition." Like
Mhm.
when you get there, it's like, oh, it's always so far from what it actually is. But there's something calling you to still describe it. And it's like you said, anytime you describe honey, no matter what you say about honey, it will never give someone the taste of honey, ever, if
Exactly.
they haven't tasted it. But for those that have tasted honey, if you describe it well, it will recall that. You see what I'm saying? And so,
Exactly.
and then you think about artists that are, so many artists and musicians are very troubled people and meet really troubled ends. And a
Yes.
lot of it, I think, is because the weight of thinking it is from them. Both the beauty of that, like,
Yes.
oh, wow, look at me, I did this. And then also the crushing self doubt and like, but am I a fraud? Because I don't know how this came to me. You know what I mean? Like, so like, but you're free from that when you realize like any beauty is from the divine presence, and it's a gift. And it's a liberation in a sense, because you're not, it doesn't have to be all on your shoulders.
That's so beautiful. Like the what you mentioned about the the tragedies of artists. You see, because as you said, you perceive like you're carrying something, and in reality, that's because art is an energy. I mean, creative inspiration, revelation. You know, God says if this Quran were to come down upon a mountain, you would see the mountain trembling. And this revelation, this type of revelation, creative inspiration, if it were to descend upon a mountain, some mountains would not be able to handle it. And so the human soul receives this constant inspiration. And so, because of that, the art, the creative inspiration for art, is actually an energy. It's like the Force,
Mm.
Star Wars.
Yeah.
And what happens when people are exposed to the Force? Every tragedy becomes an Anakin,
Mm.
right? Because there is this weight of the power that resides within, and then it's pointed out to you, and then you're regarded as like the one who is destined to bring balance to the Force.
Mm.
But then there is the narcissism of I am the one who's going to stop all of this. I am the one who's going to do this. I am the one who's going to do that. When in reality, the way of the Jedi is to just realize that the Force is there with you or without you,
Mm.
and it is moving. And you are fortunate enough, you are honored enough, you are blessed enough to be exposed to it. And so, oftentimes, we use the example of the cup. We say the cup cannot be filled when it's full, it has to be emptied before it's filled with something new. But in reality, we need to think about a new analogy, which is the analogy of the nay.
Mhm.
The nay doesn't even have a bottom.
Mhm.
It doesn't contain. It just lets things pass through. The breath just passes through, and that's what the really growing art is. That's what Hallaj was. Hallaj was like a nay. He was completely empty, so that the divine breath, when it came through him, it wasn't him speaking. Whereas Fir'aun, it's it's this ego that has gotten to the stage where it becomes so um, so filled with what it has that it thinks there is nothing else outside. And in relation to that, precisely because art is energy and creative inspiration is energy, one thing that I've always believed in is that places in the world where there is a lot of heaviness, not necessarily in terms of disasters or suffering, but even in terms of, for example, places where there is a particular type of societal problem that exists, that people do a particular type of action that causes a lot of problem. I've always believed is because of a particular energy that resides in that place. That if you are not equipped enough spiritually to handle that, it can destroy you.
Mm.
Because the like we always think of divine energy, the energy that comes from God, as being good, and it is good, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the container that's going to receive it is ready.
Right.
And I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, God Almighty, when He revealed Himself to Sayyidina Musa, the mountain perished and Sayyidina Musa fell unconscious. So, what makes human beings think that they can withstand a glimpse of a divine ray that is coming to you? And so, when we have a lot of that today, and especially today because we have this idea of complete subjectivity of art, where there is no morality in art anymore. There is no such thing as good or bad art. All art is beautiful because is a subjective eye of the beholder. Well, that's only true if we perceive art as being completely relativistic like the rest of the universe. But what I think we should be trying to do is to perceive this ancient idea of art as actually imitating a cosmic order. And this in no way whatsoever restricts the creativity. On the opposite, because what actually happens is that you're tapping into the infinite.
Mm-hmm.
You're like a small container that is being cracked open by the flood of an ocean that never stops, and every time it comes it's bigger and bigger than it was before. And so there is always inspiration. The only difference here is if you are an artist and you are a seeker on a spiritual path, you have you're like a hair, a thin hair. You see, the Abdul Aziz Dabbagh, the famous wali, he talks about he gives an example of what a fath opening is like. He says an opening that a wali receives, it's like a mountain being put on top of a hair.
Mm.
If the hair doesn't have the power to withstand that, that's like someone who asks for the opening without having the power and the light and the foundation to withstand it. It can destroy them, it can crush them.
Mm.
And so if you're an artist on a spiritual path, you're like a hair that has more power than the universe to withstand the creative inspiration. And it is no doubt, artists go through tremendous mood swings.
Uh-huh.
They do. And and for the longest time, so many people, they used to think that they have problems, like there's something wrong with them. But in reality, they weren't listening to a particular type of inspiration. They weren't taking care of it, and it was making them suffer.
Mm-hmm.
It was, and we have a lot of that in the Muslim community in the United States. We have a lot of young people who are suffering precisely because they don't have a channel and an outlet to let loose of that. I wanted to end by just mentioning a beautiful story that I came across while I was visiting the Art Institute, the Museum of Art Institute in Chicago a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading a book, and it was a story where Cezanne, the famous painter, was thought to have said that any young artist, if they want in the beginning of their journey, the thing that they should do is they should go to the museum and they should look at the paintings and try and find their teacher in the paintings.
Mm.
And their journey as an artist will be to bring the vision, the unfinished journey of that teacher, their master, to life.
Mm.
Essentially, when I read that, what I got from it is that Cézanne is saying is that a museum is actually a shrine complex.
Mm.
That artworks are like shrines. If you're listening to a musical piece, the spirit of the composer is still there. If you're looking at a painting, the spirit of the painter is inside. And it is said that Leonardo da Vinci, after he painted the Mona Lisa and he was dying, he hugged the painting. And then the king was there, he saw him. And then after he died, he still he hugged the painting. And so they came to like clean the body and everything, and they wanted to take the painting. He said, "Leave the painting with him. I'm waiting for his spirit to go into it."
Mm.
And so it's a shrine. Art is a shrine, and it is the purest instance of wilaya for the masses, for people to connect with. And then and when we know that, then it should not be a surprise that really the official religion of, for example, America, and the official means of spirituality in America is art,
Mm-hmm.
and most probably music.
Mm-hmm.
Because for a society that is so inundated with materialism, they're going to seek an outlet through the least material of art forms and try and break out of that. And the mission now, I think, as it was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, that is not to destroy anything in culture. It is not, and it is not really even to create new, completely new art forms that are so foreign to the culture in terms of the eloquence and the idioms used in the language or the musical melodies, but it is actually a change in perception. If we are able to help people regard the art they have already produced as being spiritually rooted in a larger paradigm, that will make all the difference in the world.
No. Beautiful, man. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and I think there's so much. I mean, we could go on and on about this because I fully believe that you know that and that taste of beauty too. You know, one of the divine names is beauty. You know,
Is
God is
absolutely.
beauty, and so to touch beauty and to experience beauty, to encounter beauty, it really transforms the soul. And I think we also should look at the fact that the way Western society has been transformed um, in if you think about the counterculture of the 60s and 70s and like the
Mhm.
intense amount of music that came out of that. I mean, even you could look at like the jazz era too, the 50s, because that was kind of the seeds of it. And there was so much creativity. And really, what you find in those eras with the music and the art is people really rediscovering and diving into the imaginal realm. And oftentimes it was without a kind of compass. Like it was just like,
Yes.
and you know, then that was enhanced intensely by psychedelics because people, again, which propel you deep into the imaginal realm,
Yes.
into the psyche. And so they uncover, and so what they give you, those type of things, they give you a type of yaqeen that, okay, this world isn't all there is. The material world is not all there is. And there's
Hmm.
something beyond that for sure. And so
Hmm.
then what you see that grows out of that is the turning east for spirituality and the
Exactly.
rediscovering the spiritual traditions of the West, right? You know, Christian mysticism and the Kabbalah, Sufism, Buddhism, the different forms of Hinduism that emphasize that esoteric core, from the Vedanta to certain yogic practices. So, you know, this is all related to music and art and culture and how that, you know, the fact that there's meditation studios everywhere, and that there's yoga studios, and that there's this resurging interest in Sufism and Christian
Mm-hmm.
mysticism and Kabbalah, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's all related to this. I mean, it's like one of the most important religious pilgrimages in human history. Uh, Philip Goldberg argues is the when the Beatles went to India to sit with their guru,
Absolutely.
because
Absolutely.
that was on Time magazine, that was on People magazine, and all of a sudden, these individuals who literally were at the peak of wealth, fame, influence, physical pleasures and opulence, they're saying we need something more, and they're turning
And
to
that was at the height of their art too. And
exactly,
that's so important. Yeah.
and it deeply affected their art, and you could see how that really transformed it. So, and all of a sudden it became mainstream, that people were like, oh, okay, meditation, oh, okay, yoga, oh, okay, these Eastern ideas of spirituality and things like that. And that, of course, affects, not only music, not only art, but even things which we consider part of the kind of, material aspect of the world, perhaps now,
Yes.
is like science and technology. I mean,
Yes.
right? I mean, the fact that Steve Jobs credits his experience with psychedelics and like rock and roll music, and then going to an ashram in India, it's all tied up in that. He credits that with his creative futuhat, his openings creatively, where he was able to create such influential, projects. And then Silicon Valley and all that kind of, if you look at like the cultural ethos of that, it's also
Of course.
deeply, tied into the ideas of creativity and the
Hmm.
imagination and stuff.
Hmm.
So anyway, I mean, I think this is fertile, and we could talk forever, but hopefully
Of
this is
course.
just the beginning, and we can do more of these. But man, I think that topic is really beautiful. So thank you so much for addressing
Absolutely.
it and
Thank you, Habib.
suggesting it.
No, thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure. And like one thing I can end by saying is that it's important and it's fertile precisely because for the artist, their vocation is the entire universe. Like that's their canvas. And those are the kinds of people that have the most stake in reflecting back to us what our state is, the condition of the world, and really telling us kind of like where the healing goes. And it's an important topic as it was in the time of the Beatles, as it is now, because people are just thirsty. All of humanity are thirsty, and even animals are thirsty. Like even animals are like doing these really odd behaviors that scientists are telling us, things that they can't explain through Mother Nature. And it's like because all of creation is thirsty. It's thirsty for an aesthetic root. It's thirsty for an aesthetic spiritual reality for its existence. And you and I both agree that someone like Ibn Arabi was really an artist, in the dress of a saint, and an artist, like the Beatles and like others, they're really saints in the dress of an artist. And that's why this subject is so beautiful. It yields beautiful conversations. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. All right, brother. It's good to talk to you. Next time we'll talk about your research on Jesus and Ibn Arabi's thought, inshallah.
Inshallah, Habib. Allah bless you.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you for listening to Path and Present podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so in a few ways. One is word of mouth. People hear about the podcast mostly from people like you who listen and like it and say, I know someone who would connect with this, or who would feel this, or who would enjoy this subject matter. So continue to share with your family and friends. Secondly, you can subscribe, rate, and comment on the iTunes page of Path and Present. Subscribing means that the podcast each episode will come directly to you when we release it. And rating and commenting means that it will grow and come up in the iTunes rankings, which will allow it to be available and seen by more people. And then lastly, you can support financially on Patreon. Patreon is a site which allows people to give a small amount monthly to support art or any type of content. And we have a Path and Present page on Patreon. The link is on our SoundCloud page, SoundCloud/Path and Present. And you'll find the Patreon link there. And yeah, you can support there. We're greatly appreciative of it. I guess lastly, keep us in your prayers, your positive thoughts, and your moments of remembrance. And thank you for tuning in and being part of the global Path and Present family. One love.